nostra vita,
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
Amen.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Fratres, annuscamus peccata nostra, ut aptisimus a sacra mysteria celebranda. Confitio Deo Omnipotente, et vobis fratres, qui peccavinis cositatione, verbo opere et omissione, mea culpa, mea maxima culpa, ideo pecor beatam Mariam semper Virginem, omnes angelos et sanctos, et vos fratres orare pro me, ad Dominum Deum nostrum. Miseriatur nostri omnipotens Deus, et missi peccatis nostris, perducat nos a vitam aeterna.
Amen.
Gloria in excelsis Deo. e clemente grazie tue super eos dona pontifica, ut de fide in caritate fervente, sempre in mandatis tuis vigilii, custodium persevere, per Dominum nostrum Iesu Christum Filium tuo, qui templum redemat l'unitate Spiritus Sancti, Deus per omnia saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
A reading from the book of Genesis. The Lord appeared to Abraham by the terebinth of Mamre, as he sat in the entrance of his tent, while the day was growing hot. Looking up, Abraham saw 3 men standing nearby. When he saw them, he ran from the entrance of the tent to greet them, and bowing to the ground, he said, "Sir, if I may ask of you this favor, please do not go on past your servant. Let some water be brought, that you may bathe your feet, and then rest yourselves under the tree. Now that you have come this close to your servant, let me bring you a little food, that you may refresh yourselves, and afterward you may go on your way." The men replied, "Very well, do as you have said." Abraham hastened into the tent and told Sarah, "Quick, 3 measures of fine flour, knead it and make rolls." He ran to the herd, picked out a tender choice steer, and gave it to a servant who quickly prepared it. Then Abraham got some curds and milk, as well as the steer that had been prepared, and set these before the 3 men. And he waited on them under the tree while they ate. They asked Abraham, "Where is your wife Sarah?" He replied, "There in the tent." One of them said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah will then have a son." Verbum Domini.
He who does justice will live in the presence
Lectura de la carta del apóstol San Pablo a los Colosenses. Hermanos, ahora me alegro de sufrir por ustedes, porque así completo lo que falta a la pasión de Cristo en mí, por el bien de su cuerpo, que es la Iglesia. Por disposición de Dios, yo he sido constituido ministro de esta Iglesia, para predicarles por entero su mensaje, o sea, el designio secreto que Dios ha mantenido oculto desde siglos y generaciones y que ahora ha revelado a su pueblo santo. Dios ha querido dar a conocer a los suyos la gloria y riqueza que este designio encierra para los paganos, es decir, que Cristo vive en ustedes y es la esperanza de la gloria. Ese mismo Cristo es el que nosotros predicamos cuando corregimos a los hombres y los instruimos en todos los recursos de la sabiduría, a fin de que todos sean cristianos perfectos. Verbum Domini.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et spiritu.
Lectio Sancti Evangelii secundum Luca.
Gloria a Deo,
Domine. Jesus entered a village where a woman whose name was Martha welcomed him. She had a sister named Mary, who sat beside the Lord at his feet, listening to him speak. Martha, burdened with much serving, came to him and said, "Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me by myself to do the serving? Tell her to help me." The Lord said to her in reply, "Martha, Martha, you are anxious and worried about many things. There is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, and it will not be taken from her." The Gospel of the Lord. Well, good afternoon. Buenas tardes. ¿Todo está bien? Excellent. Everybody's doing well?
Yes.
Very good. Just a couple of announcements here tonight. Remember, in the summer we don't have junior youth and children's oratory every weekend. We have it just twice a month, and so tonight there is no junior youth and children's oratory. Next week we'll pick up again. Esta noche no tenemos el oratorio juvenil, oratorio de los niños, ni el oratorio de los jóvenes, porque en el verano tenemos, no cada fin de semana, es cada segundo fin de semana. Entonces, hoy no hay esos grupos del oratorio para los niños, pero la próxima semana sí. If you a las 7, and the theme of those oratories for the children are a night of races and summer snacks. Los formularios no, lo siento. El tema de esas noches es de carreras y snacks del verano. If you haven't signed your children up for religious education yet, there's still room in the second and third session. Please sign them up as soon as possible. Si aún no has inscrito a tus hijos en educación religiosa, Todavía hay espacio en la segunda y tercera sesión de este verano. Los formularios de inscripción están disponibles en el área de la entrada y en la oficina. The forms to register your children for the summer program are in the entrance to the church and also in the office. So today is the next Sunday in our series on the Old Testament. And remember last week we talked about Abraham and how they were waiting, him and Sarah were waiting for the birth of Isaac. And you know, there's nothing more joyful than the birth of a baby. And imagine how joyful Abraham and Sarah are to have given birth to Isaac after so many years of waiting. Remember when God gave Abraham the promise, he was in his 70s. And by the time Sarah had Isaac, she was in her mid-80s. Imagine having a baby in your mid-80s. That's not, it's never easy, but imagine that. That's pretty rough. But imagine the joy also, besides the difficulty, the joy that she must have felt waiting all those years to have a baby, and now she has one. And like all babies, the baby grew and grew and grew. And when Isaac was probably a teenager, God calls out to Abraham and tells him to take the boy to a mountain that he'll show him and to sacrifice his son on that mountain. You can imagine what Abraham must have thought in that moment, how torturous that thing that God was asking him to do, how torturous that must have been for him. Yet in faith, Abraham obeys God completely, and he does what God tells him to do. God had given Abraham the son, Abraham figures, and so if God says to give him in sacrifice, Abraham will obey him. You probably remember the story, but they come to the mountain that God had chosen. And now Abraham's very old by this time. He's now, if Isaac was born when he was in his mid-80s, now he's an older teenager. He's in his late 90s when this happens. And they come to the mountain, him and Isaac, and Abraham is too old by this point to carry up all the wood for the sacrifice, because you need wood to burn the sacrifice. And so there's a lot of wood that's needed. And so Abraham can't do it. So guess who has to carry it up the mountain? Isaac. So Isaac has to carry the wood up onto the mountain. And at first, Isaac doesn't realize that he is going to be the sacrifice. But in a short time, the jig is up, and they know that he knows what's happening. Because once they get to the top of the mountain, they set up the altar, and then Abraham begins to bind the arms of Isaac. And so you can imagine what he's thinking. Oh, wait a second, I'm the sacrifice. And he has to bind his arms and his legs and lay him out over the wood. Now, like I said, Abraham is in his late 90s by now, and Isaac is a young, strong man who is able to carry all that wood up the mountain. I think Isaac could have taken his dad if he wanted to, right? And stopped him from tying him up, but Isaac doesn't do that. He trusts in God, and he trusts in his father, and he allows his father to tie his arms and his legs and to put him on the wood for the sacrifice. Imagine that bravery and trust that you have to do that. Then you know the rest of the story. The angel calls out to Abraham at the moment when Abraham is about to sacrifice his only son, and he tells him not to lay a hand on that boy. So what's going on here? It sounds pretty gruesome, right? But it really is a beautiful story what God is doing in this moment. The first thing that God is doing is he's bringing an end to human sacrifice. All the nations around Abraham were sacrificing people to their false, pagan, demonic gods. Even in our own continent, in the Americas, up until the 16th century, the Mayans and the Incas were doing human sacrifice. And so all the lands around Abraham are involved in human sacrifice to their pagan gods. And so God is bringing an end to human sacrifice by stopping Abraham in the middle of sacrificing his son and telling him not to harm the boy. That's the last time you hear about human sacrifice in Jewish history. God forbids it from that moment forward. And the Jewish people are the first ones to forbid, to outlaw human sacrifice. The second is he's testing whether or not Abraham has changed. You remember the story how God had promised them when they were in their 70s that they'd have a son, and then they're getting older and older and older, and they start to think, well, maybe we got to take matters into our own hands. And Sarah has her husband Abraham to go and have a child with Hagar the servant. Do you remember that part of the story? Well, they had lacked trust in God's promise. And so the second part of this is that God is trying to see if Abraham is a changed man. It's like God saying to him, well, how about now? Do you trust me? You had lost your trust in me back then, but do you trust me now? And will you obey me no matter what? So God is testing Abraham, both for Abraham's sake, so that he can see he's changed, and for God's sake. Now, besides Abraham, there's also Isaac. Remember, like I said, that he had to allow himself to be laid on the wood of that altar to be sacrificed. He could have fought his father in doing so. But he too trusted God, and he trusted his father, and he submitted. Doesn't he remind you of somebody else who also carried wood for the sacrifice up a mountain and laid down on that wood and was willing to sacrifice his life? Who does that sound like to you? Jesus, who carried the wood of his cross up the mountain and there laid down upon it while the soldiers nailed him to that cross. Through Mary by birth and Joseph by adoption, we know that Jesus was also a descendant of Abraham. And so it's through Jesus and his sacrifice on the cross that God fulfills the promise he made to Abraham, that through Abraham's family, all the world will be blessed. Now later, Isaac grows up after many years, and he has 2 sons. And those 2 sons are twins. They're both in their mother's womb together. And their names are Jacob and Esau. And the Bible tells us that from the time they were in the womb, they were already fighting with each other. Right? So imagine that if you're the mom, the babies are fighting in the womb already together. In fact, Scripture tells us that Esau and Jacob were born with Jacob's hand around the ankle of Esau as he was coming out of the womb. Pretty wild, right? He was trying to drag him back so he could be the first and could be the heir of his father's, of the promise that his father had received, and the heir of all that his father had. And so they have 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And I won't go into the whole story, but eventually Jacob meets and falls in love with a woman named Rachel, and he wants to marry her. But the trickster himself, Jacob had tricked his father into making him his heir instead of his brother Esau. But later on, as he gets older, he winds up getting tricked. He falls in love with a woman, Rachel. And Rachel's father, he wants to marry her. And Rachel's father said, okay, well, come and work for me for 7 years. If you work for me for free from 7 years, I'll let you marry my daughter. And so he does that after the 7 years, and the father tricks him into not marrying Rachel, but marrying the less attractive and the one who Jacob doesn't love, her sister Leah. And so Jacob is like, well, I still want to marry Rachel. And at that time, if you remember in the Bible, men could marry more than one woman. God didn't like it. It wasn't his preferred way of doing things, but it was permitted at this time. And so he wanted to marry Rachel, even though he had already accidentally married Leah. And so he works another 7 years for Rachel's father and is able to then marry Rachel. And between Rachel and Leah, his 2 wives, he has 12 sons. And his favorite son's name is, anybody know the favorite son's name? Joseph, right? I remember when I was a kid, they had the play, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. Who remembers that? Raise your hand. It was cool, right? I love that show. But anyway, Joseph was a favorite. And the other brothers weren't thrilled about Joseph being the favorite. They were envious of him. And if you remember this story, the brothers sell Joseph into slavery to Egypt. And through a series of events, Joseph winds up becoming the second in command to the Pharaoh. And through that, he winds up saving all of Egypt and even his brothers and his father and his whole family from a famine that sweeps through the whole country where they all live. Are you with me still? So we went from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, to Joseph. These are the great patriarchs of our faith. And there's a lot more to their stories. If you can dive into the book of Genesis, the first book in the Pentateuch, or what the Jewish people call the Torah, it really is fascinating and beautiful. And if you understand what's going on, it becomes even more beautiful. Through all of this, through the chain of all of these different patriarchs, beginning with Abraham all the way to Joseph, God has shown us that he's trustworthy and that he knows what he's doing. And then even when we mess it all up, even when we, for a moment, lose our trust in him, that he won't give up on us, that he'll still pursue us and he'll still pursue his will in our life. And that no matter what goes on in our life, we can place ourselves confidently in his hands with complete trust and surrender, knowing that God is trustworthy and he always fulfills his promises. No hay nada más alegre que el nacimiento de un bebé, ¿no? Sí. Imagínense la alegría de Abraham y Sara por haber dado a luz a Isaac después de tantos años de espera y anhelo por un hijo. Y así su bebé creció y creció y creció. Cuando Isaac era probablemente un adolescente, Dios lo llama y le dice que lleve a su hijo a una montaña que él le mostrará y sacrificará a su hijo en un altar sobre esa montaña. Puede imaginar la tortura que eso debe haber causado a Abraham. Sin embargo, en la fe, Abraham hace lo que Dios le dice que haga. Dios le había dado a Abraham su hijo, y si Dios pedía que ese hijo fuera sacrificado, Abraham obedecería a Dios. Y probablemente recuerde esa historia, pero ellos llegaron a la montaña que Dios había escogido. Abraham, ya muy anciano, hace que Isaac sube a la montaña toda la leña necesaria para quemar el sacrificio. Pronto Isaac se da cuenta de que él debe ser el sacrificio, pero no lucha su padre. Él también confía en Dios como su padre y confía en su padre también. Entonces conoce el resto de la historia. Un ángel llama a Abraham en el momento en que estaba a punto de sacrificar a su único hijo y le dice que no ponga una mano sobre el niño. Entonces, ¿qué estaba pasando aquí? Suena bastante espantoso, ¿no? Pero pasan dos cosas. Primero, el sacrificio humano y el sacrificio de sus propios hijos estaba muy extendido en el mundo en la época de Abraham. También aquí en las Américas, en los pueblos de los mayos y los incas, sacrificaron a personas en un sacrificio de fuego o de otras cosas, en otras maneras. Por este evento, Dios le está diciendo a Abraham y a sus descendientes que él aborrece esa práctica. Y así el pueblo judío se convierte en el primero en prohibir esta práctica en todo el mundo. Y segundo, está probando si Abraham ha cambiado o no. Recuerde el pecado con Agar. Dios está probando a Abraham para ver si realmente confía en él o no. Y además de Abraham también está Isaac. Recuerde, ahora era adolescente y Abraham tiene más de 90 años. Es más fuerte, él fue más fuerte que Abraham y podrían haber luchado para no ser sacrificado. Pero él también confió en Dios y confió en su padre. Y entonces se sometió. Él nos recuerda a otro que llevaría la madera de su sacrificio a la montaña y se sometería a la voluntad del Padre, Jesucristo. Es por eso, a través de Jesús, que la familia de Abraham se convierte en una bendición universal por todo el mundo, como Dios lo prometió en un pacto con Abraham. Y más tarde, Isaac tuvo 2 hijos gemelos, Jacob y Esaú. Y para acortar la historia, el gemelo más joven, Jacob, engaña a su padre para que lo bendiga, de modo que él se convierte en el heredero de su padre en lugar de Esaú. Más tarde, Jacob conoce y se enamora con Raquel. ¿Ustedes están conmigo? ¿Sí? Perfecto. Es mucho, y muy rápido, pero es bueno. Pero el tramposo es engañado a sí mismo y por el padre de Raquel. Jacob se casó con la hermana de Raquel, Lea, y después se casó con Raquel también. Y de ellas él se convirtió en padre de 12 hijos. Y si recuerda, José es el favorito de su padre y por eso los otros hermanos están celosos de él. Se ponen tan celosos que lo venden como esclavo a Egipto. Y a través de él, todo el Egipto y toda la familia estaba salvado de una hambruna devastadora. Todo esto, desde Abraham hasta José, Dios nos ha mostrado que Él es digno de confianza y sabe lo que está haciendo. Al igual que Abraham, Isaac, Jacob y José, todo lo que tenemos que hacer es poner nuestras vidas en sus manos, en las manos del Señor, y darle nuestra completa confianza y entrega nosotros mismos en sus manos, sabiendo que Dios es digno de confianza y siempre Él es fiel a sus promesas. Muchas gracias. Es suficiente, ¿no? Desde Abraham y después Isaac y después Jacob y después José, los patriarcas de la fe. Credo in unum Deum.
Christus,
Orate fratres, umem festum sacrificium acceptable, fiat apud Deum Patrem omnipotentem.
Susciterat omnibus sacrificium de manibus tuis, ad laudem et gloriam Dominus sui, ad utilitatem corpore nostrum, et ecclesiae suae salve.
Deus, qui legalium differentiam osiarum, unius sacrificii perfectione sanctisti, accipe sacrificium ad devotis tibi famulis, et pari benedictione sicut munera Abel sanctifica, ut quod singuli obtulerunt ad majestatis Tuae honorem, cunctis proficiat ad salutem, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Susum corda.
Habet secum.
Gratias agamus Domino Deo nostro. Vere dignum et justum est, tacum et salutare, nos tibi semper et ubique gratias agere, Domini Sancte Pater omnipotens aeterni Deus, per Christum Dominum nostrum, cuius hoc merificum fuit opus per Paschali mysterium, ut peccato et mortis iugo, ad onc gloriam vocaremur, quam nunc genus electum, regale sacerdotium, gens sancta et acquisitionis populis diceremur, et tuas annunciaremus ubique virtutis. Qui nos de tenebris ad tuum admirabile lumen vocasti, et ideo cum angelis et archangelis, cum tronis et dominationibus, cumque omni militia celestis exercitus, hymnum gloriae Tuae canimus, sine fine dicentes. Veri sanctum es Domine, fons omnis sanctitatis, ege ergo dona quesumus spiritus Tui rore sanctifica, o nobis corpus et sanguis fiat, Domini nostri Iesu Christi, qui cum passione voluntaria et traderetur, accepi panem, et gratias angens fregit, derique discipulis suis dicens. Accipite et manducate ex hoc omnis, hoc est enim corpus meum, quod pro vobis tradetur. Simili modo, post continuatum est, accipiens et calicem, iterum tibi gratias angens derete cipulis suis dicens. Accivite et bibite ex eo omnes, hic est enim cali sanguinis mei, novi et eterni testamenti, qui pro vobis et pro multis affundetur, in remissionem peccatorum, hoc facite in meum commemorationem. Mysterium Fidei. Memore seditor mortis et resurrectionis eius, tibi Domine in panem vitae, et calitem salutis offerimus. Gratias agentes qui nos dignus abuisti, estare coram te et tibi ministerare, ut supplices te precamur, ut corporis et sanguinis Christi participes, a Spiritus Sancto congregemur in unum. Recordare, Domini, Ecclesiae Tue toto orbe diffuse, utem in caritate perficias, unicum Papa nostro Francisco, et Episcopo nostro Davilo, et universo claro. Memento etiam fratum nostrorum, quinque resurrectionis dormierum, omniumque in Tua miseratione defunctorum, et eos in lumen vultus Tui ermite, omnium nostrum quesumus miserere, ut cum beata Dei Delectrice Virgine Maria, beato Iosef eo sponso, beatis apostolis et omnibus sanctis, qui tibi a seculo plaquerunt, aeterne vitae meriamur esse consortes, et te laudemus et glorificemus, per Filium Tuum, Iesum Christum. Per ipsum et cum ipsor in ipso, est tibi Deo Pater omnipotenti, in unitate Spiritus Sancti, todo honor y toda gloria por los siglos de los siglos. Preceptis salutaribus moniti, et benedictione formati, ademus dicere, Pater noster, qui es in celis, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis vita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Libera nos quesumus Domine, ab omnibus malis, da propitius patem in diebus nostris, ut opi misericordiae tua adiuti, et a peccato simus semper liberi, et ab omni perturbatione securi, expectantes beatum spem, et aventum saltoris nostri Iesu Christi. Nomine Iesu Christi, qui existi apostolis tuis, patrem lingu vobis, patrem meam de vobis. Ne despicias peccata nostra, sed fidem ecclesiae tui, e amque secundum voluntatem tuam, pacificari et coordinari digneris, qui vias serenas in saecula saeculorum.
Amen.
Pax Domini sit semper vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tuo.
Sanguinem tuum, ad omnibus iniquitatibus meis et universis malis, facme tui semper venerare mandatis, et ad innumquam separare permittas. Eti agnus Dei, eti qui tolli peccati mundi, beate qui ad cenum agni peccati sunt. Domine, nostrum Dominus, ut enteris tectum meum, sed tantum de verbo, et sanabitur animam meum.
Amen.
Oremos. Populo tuo quismus Domine adesso propitius, et quam mysteries celestibus imbuisti, fac ad novitatem vitae de vetustas te transire, per Christum Dominum nostrum. Dominus vobiscum. Benedicat vos omnipotens Deus, Pater et Filius et Spiritus Sanctus. Amen. Ite missa est. Deo gratias.